The volcanic ash swirled like ghostly phantoms across the black beaches of Iwo Jima. As dawn broke on February 19, 1945, through the morning mist, the silhouette of Mount Suribachi loomed like a sleeping giant, its slopes hiding secrets that would soon extract a terrible price. From the brave souls about to storm its shores, Lieutenant Colonel James Roosevelt, son of the late President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, stood aboard the USS El Dorado, watching the pre-invasion bombardment rain down on the 8-square-mile island. The thunder of naval artillery echoed across the Pacific waters as battleships and cruisers unleashed their fury upon the seemingly barren landscape. Yet something felt different about this operation. An ominous silence seemed to answer each thunderous salvo. Major General Harry Schmidt, commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps, had been briefing his officers for weeks about what lay ahead. Intelligence reports suggested that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the Japanese commander, had transformed this sulfur-smelling island into an impregnable fortress. The Japanese had learned harsh lessons from their previous defeats in the Pacific, abandoning their traditional banzai charges in favor of a more deadly strategy, defense in depth. According to information from the U.S. Navy Historical Center, approximately 60,000 U.S. service members would face roughly 21,000 Japanese troops in this crucial battle. The numbers seemed favorable, but the Marines had no idea what horrors awaited them beneath the island's deceptively quiet surface. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions prepared for the initial assault, their landing craft bobbing in the choppy waters like a fleet of metal insects ready to swarm the shore. Corporal John Bradley, a Navy corpsman attached to the 5th Marines, checked his medical supplies one final time. The 21-year-old from Wisconsin had seen action before, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to witness. As the first wave of landing craft approached the beach, the Marines could see the strange, ash-colored sand that would become their battlefield. The island's volcanic composition created an otherworldly landscape: black sand dunes that shifted treacherously underfoot, sulfur springs that stank of rotten eggs, and rocky terrain that seemed designed by nature itself to favor the defender. Colonel Harry Liversedge of the 28th Marines studied the imposing Mount Suribachi through his binoculars. At 556 feet high, the extinct volcano dominated the southern tip of the island, its slopes honeycombed with caves and tunnels that intelligence suggested housed artillery pieces and machine gun nests. Taking Suribachi would be essential to securing the beachhead, but the mountain looked as formidable as any fortress ever built by man. The preliminary bombardment had lasted for days, yet as the Marines approached the shore, they noticed something unsettling. Unlike previous Pacific battles where Japanese positions had been visibly destroyed by naval gunfire, Iwo Jima showed few signs of damage. The black sand appeared untouched, the rocky outcroppings intact, and most disturbing of all, there was no return fire from the Japanese defenders. Sergeant Michael Strank, a Czech immigrant who had risen through the ranks of the 28th Marines, gathered his squad around him for final instructions. At 24, he was considered an old man by Marine standards, but his experience and steady leadership had earned him the respect of younger Marines, like Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian from Arizona who had joined the Corps seeking adventure and purpose. The silence from the Japanese positions was deafening. As the landing craft pushed through the surf toward the volcanic shores, many Marines began to wonder if the enemy had abandoned the island. Some dared to hope that this would be easier than the bloodbaths at Saipan and Guam. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The first Marines to hit the beach found themselves struggling against an enemy they hadn't expected. The island itself, the volcanic ash, was so soft and deep that men sank to their ankles with each step, while vehicles became hopelessly bogged down in the treacherous terrain. The black sand shifted and moved like quicksand, making it impossible to establish solid footing or dig proper fighting positions. As more Marines poured onto the beach, they spread out according to their training, expecting the familiar crack of rifle fire and the whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Instead, they encountered an eerie calm that made every man's skin crawl. The Japanese were watching, waiting, letting the Americans come to them. deep beneath the island's surface, in a network of tunnels and bunkers that would have impressed the builders of the Great Wall of China. General Kuribayashi's forces were preparing to unleash hell upon the unsuspecting Marines. The stage was set for what would become one of the most savage battles in Marine Corps' history. The deceptive calm shattered like glass at precisely 10:30 in the morning. As the fourth wave of Marines struggled through the volcanic sand, the island suddenly erupted in a symphony of death. From hidden positions that had remained invisible during days of bombardment, Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened fire with devastating precision. Captain Dave Severance of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, threw himself flat against the black sand as the first shells screamed overhead. The carefully planned landing formation dissolved into chaos as Marines scrambled for cover that simply didn't exist on the exposed beaches. The soft volcanic ash that had hindered their movement now became their only protection as they desperately tried to dig fighting positions. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, a 19-year-old farm boy from Kentucky, pressed his face into the sulfur-scented sand as machine gun bullets whined over his head. The friendly, gap-toothed grin that had earned him friends throughout boot camp was now replaced by the grim determination of a Marine under fire. Round him, his fellow Marines were discovering the true nature of their enemy's defensive strategy. General Kuribayashi had transformed Iwo Jima into a fortress, unlike anything the Americans had previously encountered. Instead of trying to stop the invasion at the beach, he had allowed the Marines to land, then trap them in a killing field. Every cave, every rocky outcropping, every seemingly innocent hill had been turned into a firing position. The Japanese had spent months preparing for this moment, and their patience was now paying dividends in American blood. The Marines' initial objectives seemed impossibly distant as they struggled to move inland. The 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, had been assigned to isolate Mount Suribachi by cutting across the narrow neck of the island. As they advanced, they encountered resistance that defied imagination. Japanese soldiers emerged from spider holes to fire at the Marines' backs, then disappeared into the earth like deadly phantoms. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, watched his men take casualties at an alarming rate. The standard tactics that had served the Corps well in previous campaigns seemed useless against an enemy who had literally become one with the island. Every step forward was paid for in blood, and the Marines were learning that Iwo Jima would be won not through maneuver and speed, but through raw courage and determination. As reported by the History Channel, the beaches of Iwo Jima were made up of steep dunes of soft, gray volcanic ash, which made getting sturdy footing and passage for vehicles difficult. This challenging terrain, combined with the intensity of Japanese fire, created a nightmare scenario for the attacking Marines. Corporal Tony Stein of the 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines, had fashioned his own weapon from a crashed Navy fighter plane's machine gun. The Stinger, as he called it, proved devastatingly effective against Japanese positions, but it also made him a target for every enemy sniper on the island. Stein's aggressive tactics and refusal to take cover while engaging the enemy would later earn him the Medal of Honor, though he would not live to receive it. The 4th Marine Division, landing on the right flank, encountered their own version of hell as they pushed toward the island's first airfield. The Japanese had transformed the seemingly flat terrain into a maze of interconnected bunkers and tunnels. Marines would think they had cleared a position, only to have it spring back to life as fresh defenders emerged from underground passages. Hospital Corpsman John Bradley worked frantically to save wounded Marines under the relentless fire. The young Wisconsin native had trained for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the scale of carnage he witnessed. As he moved from one wounded Marine to another, he began to understand that this battle would be unlike any other in the Pacific War. The Japanese defensive system was more sophisticated than anything the Americans had encountered. Concrete bunkers had been built into the natural rock formations, their embrasures carefully positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery pieces had been hauled deep into caves, allowing them to fire and then retreat into the tunnels before counter-battery fire could locate them. By the end of the first day, the Marines had advanced only a few hundred yards inland at a cost of more than 2,000 casualties. The beachhead was secure, but barely, and the sight of so many wounded and dead Marines sobered even the most optimistic commanders. They were beginning to realize that the intelligence estimates for this operation had been woefully optimistic. As darkness fell on February 19th, the Marines dug in for their first night on Iwo Jima. The volcanic ash made digging difficult, but the alternative, spending the night exposed to Japanese fire, was unthinkable. The enemy had shown their willingness to infiltrate American positions under cover of darkness, and every Marine knew that the night would bring its own special terrors. The sulfur smell that gave the island its name seemed to grow stronger in the darkness, mixing with the acrid scent of cordite and the metallic smell of blood. As the Marines huddled in their shallow foxholes, they could hear the Japanese moving through their tunnel system, preparing for another day of hell. Dawn on February 20th revealed the true scope of the carnage from the previous day. The black sand beaches were littered with the debris of war-abandoned equipment, destroyed landing craft, and the still forms of Marines who had paid the ultimate price for their first foothold on Japanese soil. The sulfur springs continued to bubble and steam, adding an otherworldly quality to the scene of devastation. Major General Harry Schmidt stood in his command post, studying the maps with growing concern. The Marines had penetrated only a few hundred yards inland, far short of their planned objectives. The Japanese defensive system was proving more formidable than anyone had imagined, and the casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. Every yard of ground would have to be paid for in blood. The 28th Marines received their orders for the second day: isolate Mount Suribachi and begin the assault on the mountain itself. As the Marines moved out from their positions, they encountered the same deadly precision that had characterized the Japanese defense from the beginning. Every advance was met with carefully coordinated fire from positions that seemed to materialize from the very rocks themselves. Sergeant Michael Strank led his squad forward through the volcanic ash, each step a struggle against both the treacherous terrain and the ever-present threat of enemy fire. The 24-year-old Pennsylvania native had already earned the respect of his men through his calm leadership under fire, but even he was beginning to wonder if they could overcome the Japanese defenses. The first airfield, designated Airfield No. 1 by American planners, became a particular focus of fierce fighting. The Japanese had turned the runway and surrounding areas into a fortress, with pillboxes and bunkers positioned to provide mutual support. The 4th Marine Division found themselves locked in a deadly struggle for every building, every hangar, every foot of tarmac. Private First Class Ira Hayes, the quiet Pima Indian from Arizona, moved carefully through the ruins of what had once been an aircraft hangar. The Japanese had booby-trapped everything they abandoned, and Hayes had already seen too many Marines killed by seemingly innocent objects that exploded when touched. His natural caution, honed by years of hunting in the Arizona desert, served him well in this deadly environment. The Marines quickly learned that the Japanese had developed new tactics specifically for this battle. Instead of the traditional banzai charges that had characterized previous engagements, the defenders fought from carefully prepared positions, inflicting maximum casualties before withdrawing to secondary positions. It was a strategy designed to make the Americans pay dearly for every yard of ground. As documented by the National Museum of the Pacific War, historians later described the battle for Iwo Jima as throwing human flesh against reinforced concrete. The Marines were discovering the truth of this assessment with each costly advance across the island's hostile terrain. Corporal John Bradley continued his work as a Navy corpsman, moving from one wounded Marine to another under constant fire. The young man from Wisconsin had developed a reputation for fearlessness, crawling into exposed positions to reach wounded Marines regardless of the danger to himself. His medical bag seemed to be bottomless, but even he was running low on supplies as the casualties mounted. The Japanese had prepared for a siege, stockpiling ammunition and supplies in their underground network. American intelligence had estimated that the island could be taken in 4 to 5 days, but by the second day, it was becoming clear that this battle would last much longer. The Marines were fighting not just an enemy army, but an entire island that had been transformed into a weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson's 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, began their approach to Mount Suribachi itself. The extinct volcano loomed above them like a malevolent presence, its slopes pockmarked with cave entrances and defensive positions. Johnson knew that taking Suribachi would require more than courage. It would require a willingness to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable. In any previous campaign, the mountain's defenders had spent months preparing for this assault. Every approach had been surveyed and targeted. Every possible avenue of attack had been blocked or fortified. The Japanese had learned from their defeats elsewhere in the Pacific, and they were determined to make the Americans pay a price so high that the cost of invading Japan itself would become prohibitive. As the Marines pressed forward, they encountered defensive positions that defied conventional military wisdom. Bunkers had been built into the natural rock formations, making them virtually invisible from the air and immune to all but direct hits from the heaviest artillery. Machine gun nests had been positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that no approach was left uncovered. The volcanic terrain that had seemed so alien to the Marines on their first day was becoming familiar in the worst possible way. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of Japanese positions, the way the ash had been disturbed, the unnatural shadows that might conceal cave entrances, the silence that often preceded an ambush. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, the farm boy from Kentucky, found himself thinking about home as he hugged the black sand under enemy fire. The rolling hills of his native state seemed like paradise compared to this sulfur-scented hellscape, yet he pressed forward with his squad, driven by the same sense of duty that had brought thousands of young Americans to this godforsaken island. The Marines' advance was measured not in miles or even hundreds of yards, but in the much smaller increments that marked the true cost of victory. Each bunker cleared, each cave sealed, each defensive position eliminated brought them closer to their objective. But the price was always the same: good Marines who would never see home again. As night fell on the second day, the Marines consolidated their meager gains and prepared for another night of vigilance. The Japanese had proven their willingness to counterattack under cover of darkness, and every Marine knew that survival depended on staying alert through the long, sulfur-scented night. The third day of battle dawned with the same sulphurous haze that had become the signature of Iwo Jima, but the Marines who greeted it were changed men. The wide-eyed optimism of the landing had been replaced by the grim determination of warriors who understood the true nature of their enemy. They had learned that this island would test not just their courage, but their very souls. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson received word that his 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, would spearhead the assault on Mount Suribachi. The mountain had become more than a military objective, it had become a symbol of Japanese resistance and American determination. Johnson knew that taking Suribachi would require the kind of heroism that men discover only in the crucible of combat. The approach to the mountain was a nightmare of cross-cutting fire and hidden positions. Japanese defenders had turned every rock, every fold in the terrain, every natural depression into a killing ground. The Marines advanced by rushes, small groups sprinting from one meager piece of cover to the next while their comrades provided covering fire. Sergeant Michael Strank had already proven himself a natural leader, but the assault on Suribachi would test even his considerable skills. The Pennsylvania native gathered his squad around him before the advance, speaking in the calm, measured tones that had earned him the respect of younger Marines, like Private First Class Ira Hayes and Franklin Sousley. The attack began at dawn, with the Marines advancing in small groups up the treacherous slopes. The volcanic ash that had plagued them on the beaches was even worse on the mountain, where it combined with loose rock to create an unstable surface that threatened to send attackers tumbling back down the slope. Every step was a struggle against both gravity and the enemy. Private First Class Ira Hayes found himself thinking about the red rocks of his native Arizona as he climbed the black slopes of Suribachi. The quiet Pima Indian had always been more comfortable in the wilderness than in the company of others, but this alien landscape tested even his considerable outdoor skills. The mountain seemed to resist their advance with malevolent purpose. The Japanese had prepared Suribachi's defenses with the same meticulous care. They had shown throughout the island. Cave entrances were positioned to provide mutual support, with defenders able to retreat through connecting tunnels when one position became untenable. The Marines found themselves fighting not just up the mountain, but into it, as they attempted to root out defenders from their underground strongholds. Corporal John Bradley continued his work as a Navy corpsman, following the assault troops up the mountain to provide medical care to the wounded. The young man from Wisconsin had already earned a reputation for courage under fire, but the assault on Suribachi would test even his remarkable bravery. The mountain slopes offered little cover for a man trying to reach wounded Marines. The fighting was intensely personal, with Americans and Japanese often close enough to see each other's faces. The Marines learned to work in small teams, with one group providing covering fire while another advanced to eliminate a specific position. It was costly, time-consuming work, but it was the only way to make progress against such determined defenders. As recorded by the National Museum of the Marine Corps, the final death toll among Marines was 5,931 killed in action, died of wounds or missing in action, and presumed dead. The staggering number would make Iwo Jima one of the costliest battles in Marine Corps history. But on the third day, the Marines were only beginning to understand the price they would pay for victory. The Japanese defensive strategy was beginning to show its true diabolical nature. Every position the Marines cleared seemed to come back to life as fresh defenders emerged from hidden tunnels. Machine gun nests that had been silenced would suddenly reopen fire from different angles. Artillery pieces that had been destroyed would be replaced by others hauled through the underground network. Private First Class Franklin Sousley found himself separated from his squad. During a particularly intense firefight, the young Kentucky native took cover behind a rocky outcropping, trying to rejoin his unit while Japanese bullets chipped away at his meager shelter. The friendly, gap-toothed grin that had made him popular with his fellow Marines was now replaced by the focused intensity of a combat veteran. The Marines' advance up Mount Suribachi was measured in yards rather than miles, but each yard represented a victory of human courage over seemingly impossible odds. The mountain's defenders had every advantage: superior positions, prepared defenses, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Yet somehow, incredibly, the Marines continued to advance. Captain Dave Severance, commanding Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, watched his men climb the mountain with a mixture of pride and anguish. He had trained these Marines, knew their strengths and weaknesses, their hopes and fears. Seeing them face such determined resistance required a kind of courage that no military academy could teach. The assault on Suribachi had become a test of wills between two warrior cultures. The Japanese were fighting for their homeland, their emperor, and their honor. The Marines were fighting for their country, their corps, and each other. Both sides understood that this battle would be decided not by superior tactics or technology, but by the willingness of individual men to sacrifice everything for their cause. As the third day ended, the Marines had advanced less than halfway up the mountain, but they had established a foothold that would prove crucial in the days to come. The Japanese defenders were beginning to show signs of strain, their carefully coordinated fire becoming less precise as casualties mounted and supplies dwindled. The Marines dug in for another night on the hostile slopes, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same deadly struggle. Yet something had changed in their demeanor. They had looked into the face of their enemy and found that they were not afraid. The mountain could kill them, but it could not break their spirit. February 22nd dawned cold and gray, the sulfur mist hanging over Mount Suribachi like a burial shroud. The Marines of the 28th Regiment had been fighting for 3 days to reach this point, and now they faced the final, desperate push to the summit. Every man knew that reaching the top of the mountain would be more than a tactical victory. It would be a symbol of American determination that would resonate far beyond this sulfur-scented island. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson stood at his forward command post, studying the mountain through his binoculars. The Japanese defenders had been forced back, but they were far from defeated. Intelligence reports suggested that the enemy still held strong positions near the summit, and Johnson knew that the final assault would be the most dangerous yet. The night had been filled with the usual sounds of war: the distant crack of sniper fire, the occasional explosion of a grenade, the whispered conversations of Marines checking on their wounded comrades. But there had been something else, something that veteran Marines recognized as the sound of an enemy. Preparing for a last desperate stand, Sergeant Michael Strank gathered his squad in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces illuminated by the brief flare of a cigarette lighter. The men looked older than their years, aged by the constant stress of combat and the terrible sights they had witnessed. Yet there was something in their eyes, a determination that had been forged in the crucible of battle. The assault began at first light, with the Marines advancing in small groups up the treacherous slopes. The Japanese had prepared their final defensive positions with the same meticulous care they had shown throughout the battle, but their ammunition was running low and their numbers had been severely depleted by days of constant fighting. Private First Class Ira Hayes moved carefully through the rocky terrain, his Arizona hunting instincts serving him well in this deadly environment. The quiet Pima Indian had proven himself a reliable fighter, though he remained troubled by the violence he had witnessed. The mountain seemed to press down on him with its malevolent presence. The fighting near the summit was particularly intense, with Japanese defenders emerging from hidden positions to engage the Marines in close combat. Grenades exploded among the black rocks, sending volcanic ash and stone fragments flying through the air. The Marines pressed forward, driven by a momentum that had been building for days. Corporal John Bradley continued his work as a Navy corpsman, following the assault troops up the mountain despite the obvious danger. The young man from Wisconsin had already saved countless lives during the battle, but the final assault would test his courage in ways he had never imagined. The mountain slopes offered little protection for a man trying to reach wounded Marines. As the Marines neared the summit, they encountered the last organized resistance on Mount Suribachi. The Japanese had prepared a final defensive line among the rocks at the mountain's peak, and they fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they would never see home again. The sound of gunfire echoed across the island, alerting everyone that the climactic moment had arrived. The breakthrough came suddenly. As breakthroughs often do in combat, a Marine squad managed to flank a key Japanese position, and the defenders' carefully coordinated defense began to crumble. One by one, the remaining positions were overrun, and the Marines found themselves standing on the rim of the extinct volcano. Lieutenant Harold Schreier of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, had been given a special mission by Lieutenant Colonel Johnson. Wrapped in his pack was a small American flag, and he had been ordered to raise it on the summit of Mount Suribachi when the position was secure. The flag had been obtained from the USS Missoula, and it would become one of the most famous symbols in American military history. The first flag raising occurred at approximately 10:20 in the morning on February 23, 1945. The Marines who participated in this historic moment were Lieutenant Schreier, Sergeant Ernest Thomas, Sergeant Henry Hansen, and Corporal Charles Leinberg. The flag was small, but its symbolism was enormous. It represented the first time the American flag had been raised on Japanese soil. The sight of the flag flying from the summit of Mount Suribachi electrified the Marines fighting across the island. Men who had been pinned down by enemy fire stood up in their foxholes to cheer, despite the obvious danger. The flag represented hope, victory, and the promise that their sacrifices had not been in vain. However, the first flag was considered too small to be seen clearly from across the island. Later that morning, a decision was made to replace it with a larger flag that would be visible to all the Marines. On Iwo Jima, the second flag raising would become one of the most famous photographs in American history, though few realized its significance at the time. The Marines selected for the second flag raising were Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Ira Hayes, Private First Class Rene Gagnon, and Navy Corpsman John Bradley. These 6 men would become symbols of American courage and sacrifice. Though 3 of them would not survive the battle, The photograph of the second flag raising was taken by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal, who had climbed the mountain to document the historic moment. The image captured the Marines in the act of raising the flag, their bodies straining against the weight of the pole and the force of the wind. It was a spontaneous moment of triumph that would inspire a nation. As the flag snapped in the sulfur-scented breeze, the Marines on the summit of Mount Suribachi could see the full extent of the island spread out below them. The battle was far from over. The Japanese still held strong positions in the northern part of the island, and the fighting there would prove even more savage than the assault on Suribachi. The capture of Mount Suribachi had taken 4 days and cost hundreds of Marine lives, but it had achieved something beyond mere tactical success. It had proven that the Japanese could be defeated, that their seemingly impregnable defenses could be overcome by American courage and determination. The flag flying from the summit would become a symbol of hope not just for the Marines on Iwo Jima, but for all Americans fighting in the Pacific War. With Mount Suribachi secured and the American flag flying proudly from its summit, the Marines turned their attention to the more daunting task that lay before them. The northern 2/3 of Iwo Jima remained in Japanese hands, and intelligence reports suggested that the defenses there were even more formidable than those they had just overcome. The mountain had been merely the beginning of their ordeal. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, studied the terrain maps with growing concern. The northern part of the island was a maze of ridges, ravines, and rocky outcroppings that the Japanese had spent months transforming into an impregnable fortress. Unlike the relatively straightforward assault on Mount Suribachi, the advance north would require coordinated attacks by 3 full Marine divisions across terrain that seemed designed by nature to favor the defender. The Japanese had learned from their defeat at Suribachi and had adjusted their tactics accordingly. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had positioned his strongest forces in the northern sector, where the terrain provided natural advantages that even the most skilled military engineers could not have improved upon. Every ridge concealed artillery positions, every ravine contained machine gun nests, and every seemingly innocent hilltop bristled with carefully camouflaged bunkers. Colonel Harry Liversedge's 28th Marines, fresh from their victory at Suribachi, were assigned to support the main assault on the northern defenses. The men who had raised the flag on the mountain now faced an even greater challenge as they prepared to attack positions that intelligence described as virtually impregnable. The advance began on February 24th, with the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions attacking abreast across the island's width. The terrain immediately proved problematic, with the volcanic ash giving way to hard rock that made digging nearly impossible. The Marines found themselves advancing across open ground, under the observation of Japanese spotters positioned on the commanding heights. Private First Class Ira Hayes, one of the Marines who had raised the flag on Suribachi, found himself assigned to a rifle company advancing toward the ridgeline that the Marines had christened Hilt 160. The quiet Pima Indian had hoped that his participation in the historic flag raising would earn him a ticket home, but the Corps had other plans for him. The fighting in the northern sector was different from the assault on Mount Suribachi. Here, the Japanese had prepared defense in depth, with multiple lines of bunkers and firing positions that could provide mutual support. The Marines would clear one position, only to find themselves under fire from another that had been invisible until that moment. Corporal John Bradley, the Navy corpsman who had been present at the flag raising, continued his work of saving lives under impossible conditions. The young man from Wisconsin had already been wounded twice, but he refused evacuation, knowing that his fellow Marines needed him. The northern sector's rocky terrain made it even more difficult to reach wounded men, but Bradley's courage never wavered. The Marines quickly discovered that the Japanese had prepared specific defensive positions that would become legendary for their savagery. Areas like the Meat Grinder, Bloody Gorge, and Turkey Knob were killing grounds where the defenders had prepared interlocking fields of fire that could cut down entire squads in seconds. Each position had to be taken through direct assault, with Marines literally throwing themselves against reinforced concrete and steel. Sergeant Michael Strank, the Pennsylvania native, who had shown such leadership during the assault on Suribachi, led his squad forward through the rocky terrain north of the captured mountain. The 24-year-old had become a father figure to the younger Marines in his unit, but even his steady presence could not fully prepare them for the horror that awaited in the northern sector. The Japanese defensive system in the north was a masterpiece of military engineering. General Kuribayashi had spent months studying the terrain, positioning his forces to take maximum advantage of every natural feature. Artillery pieces were positioned in caves that could be sealed immediately after firing, making counter-battery fire virtually impossible. Machine gun nests were built into the natural rock formations, their embrasures carefully positioned to create killing fields that covered every possible approach. As documented by the Pacific War Museum, the defenders had created strongholds so heavily fortified that troops gave them nicknames like the Meat Grinder and Bloody Gorge. These positions would become synonymous with the savage fighting that characterized the Northern Campaign. The Marines' advance was measured in yards, with each day's progress purchased at a terrible price in casualties. The volcanic rock that covered much of the northern sector was too hard for conventional digging, forcing the Marines to build up their defensive positions with loose stones and sandbags. The Japanese, with months to prepare, had blasted elaborate tunnel systems that connected their various positions and allowed defenders to move unseen between firing points. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, the friendly farm boy from Kentucky, who had helped raise the flag on Suribachi, found himself leading a squad through a nightmare landscape of rocky ridges and hidden bunkers. The gap-toothed grin that had made him popular with his fellow Marines was now replaced by the grim determination of a veteran who had seen too much death. The fighting in the northern sector took on a particularly personal character, with Americans and Japanese often close enough to see each other's faces. The Marines learned to work in small teams, with one group providing covering fire while another advanced to eliminate a specific position. Flamethrowers became essential weapons, as they were often the only way to clear bunkers that were immune to conventional explosives. The Japanese had prepared for a siege, stockpiling ammunition and supplies in their underground network. Unlike the relatively quick victory at Mount Suribachi, the Northern Campaign would become a grinding battle of attrition that would test the Marines' endurance as much as their courage. Every position had to be taken individually, and the defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they would never surrender. As the Marines pressed forward through the rocky terrain, they began to understand the true scope of their enemy's preparations. This was not simply a military position to be captured, it was an entire region that had been transformed into a weapon designed to kill as many Americans as possible. Before the inevitable defeat, the northern sector of Iwo Jima would become the graveyard of heroes, where men who had survived the landing beaches and the assault on Mount Suribachi would finally meet their fate among the volcanic rocks and sulfur springs of this hellish island. March approached with the same sulphurous dawn that had greeted the Marines for 2 weeks of unrelenting combat. The northern sector of Iwo Jima had become a charnel house where the finest young men of America were paying the ultimate price for each yard of volcanic rock. The optimistic predictions of a quick victory had long since been abandoned, replaced by the grim reality of a battle that would be won only through the accumulation of individual acts of heroism. The Marines who had raised the flag on Mount Suribachi were now scattered across the northern battleground, their moment of triumph seeming like a distant memory. Sergeant Michael Strank, the steady Pennsylvania native who had provided leadership to so many younger Marines, was killed by enemy artillery fire on March 1, 1945. His death was a devastating blow to the men who had looked up to him, particularly Private First Class Ira Hayes, who had come to regard Strank as an older brother. The Japanese defenders in the northern sector were fighting with the desperate courage of men who knew they were doomed. General Kuribayashi's strategy of defense in depth was exacting a terrible toll on both sides, but the writing was on the wall. American industrial might and the seemingly endless supply of reinforcements would eventually overcome even the most determined resistance. Private First Class Franklin Sousley, the cheerful farm boy from Kentucky who had helped raise the flag on Suribachi, was killed by sniper fire on March 21st, just 5 days before the island was officially declared secure. His death came as a shock to the survivors of Easy Company, who had begun to believe that the men who had raised the flag bore some kind of charmed protection. The reality was far grimmer. Courage and honor provided no shield against Japanese bullets. The fighting in areas like the Meat Grinder and Bloody Gorge had taken on an almost ritualistic quality, with small groups of Marines advancing against prepared positions in attacks that resembled medieval sieges more than modern warfare. Each bunker had to be approached individually, with Marines crawling forward under covering fire to place explosive charges or direct flamethrower attacks against the embrasures. Corporal Harlan Block, the Texas native who had been one of the flag raisers, was killed by mortar fire on March 1st, the same day as Sergeant Strank. Block had been a powerful presence among the Marines, his size and strength making him invaluable in the brutal close-quarters fighting that characterized the Northern Campaign. His death left another void in the ranks of Easy Company that could never be filled. The Marines had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of Japanese positions. A shadow that fell in the wrong direction might conceal a cave entrance. A seemingly natural pile of rocks might hide a machine gun nest. The slightest movement in the peripheral vision could indicate a sniper taking aim. These hard-won lessons were passed down from veteran to replacement, creating a body of knowledge that existed nowhere in any military manual. As reported by the Marine Corps' Historical Division, the battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of continuous combat. The statistics were staggering. Of the approximately 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest had died fighting, fulfilling their oath to resist to the last man. The American casualties were equally devastating. The Marines suffered 6,821 killed in action, with another 19,417 wounded. The Navy lost 581 men, bringing the total American casualties to over 26,000. These numbers represented nearly 30% of the landing force, making Iwo Jima one of the costliest battles in American military history. Private First Class Ira Hayes, the quiet Pima Indian who had helped raise the flag on Mount Suribachi, was among the survivors who were eventually evacuated from the island. The experience had changed him profoundly, leaving him with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The fame that came from the flag-raising photograph would prove to be as much a burden as a blessing, as Hayes struggled to reconcile his role as a national hero with the reality of what he had experienced on the island. Corpsman John Bradley, the Navy medic who had risked his life countless times to save wounded Marines, was also among the survivors. The young man from Wisconsin had been wounded 3 times during the battle, but had refused evacuation until he was physically unable to continue. His courage under fire had earned him the Navy Cross, but the memories of the men he couldn't save would haunt him for the rest of his life. The capture of Iwo Jima had achieved its strategic objective of providing a base for emergency landings by damaged B-29 bombers returning from raids on Japan. By the end of the war, over 2,400 bomber crews had made emergency landings on the island, representing approximately 27,000 airmen whose lives were saved. By the Marines' sacrifice, General Kuribayashi's body was never found, though it was presumed that he had died in the final days of fighting. The Japanese commander had proven to be a worthy adversary, transforming a small volcanic island into a fortress that had tested the Marines to their very limits. His tactical innovations, particularly the use of defense in depth and the abandonment of traditional banzai charges, had influenced Japanese defensive strategy for the remainder of the war. The flag that had been raised on Mount Suribachi on February 23rd became one of the most powerful symbols in American history. The photograph taken by Joe Rosenthal inspired the famous statue at the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, and became a symbol of American determination and sacrifice. Yet for the survivors of the battle, the flag represented something more personal the memory of friends who had died to place it there. The battle for Iwo Jima had demonstrated both the incredible courage of the individual Marine and the terrible cost of victory in the Pacific War. The lessons learned on the sulfur-scented island would influence American military planning for the proposed invasion of Japan, contributing to the decision to use atomic weapons rather than accept the casualties that a direct assault would have entailed. As the last Marines were evacuated from Iwo Jima, they left behind more than just their dead comrades. They left behind their youth, their innocence, and their faith in the romance of war. The island had taught them that victory was possible, but it had also shown them the true price of freedom. The volcanic ash that had clung to their uniforms would wash away, but the memories of what they had experienced would remain with them forever. The 8 square miles of volcanic rock that had seemed so insignificant on the map had become a crucible where ordinary young men had been transformed into legends. The Battle of Iwo Jima had indeed shown the world the might of the U.S. Marines, but it had also revealed the terrible cost of that might. In the end, the island belonged to the dead, both American and Japanese, who had fought and died among its sulfur springs and black volcanic beaches. The legacy of Iwo Jima would endure long after the last veteran had passed away. It would serve as a reminder of what free men could accomplish when they were willing to sacrifice everything for their beliefs, and as a warning of the price that such sacrifice would always demand. The flag that flew from Mount Suribachi had been raised not just in victory, but in memory of all those who had fallen to place it there. The Marines had indeed shown the world their might, but they had also shown the world their humanity. In the end, that may have been the most important lesson of all.